Okay, so in this video, I'm going to describe the Callipolis, the beautiful city, never called or rarely called the beautiful city by Socrates. I think he calls it that in maybe a joking way after Glaucon and Adeimantus reject his healthy city. But it's what scholars have taken to calling it. So I'm going to describe the Callipolis, not in any detail. I've cut out a lot of the description of the Callipolis from the Republic for your readings. And the reason is that, I mean, for one thing, a lot of it's not interesting. So he literally, like Plato literally does have Socrates line edit poems, famous Greek poems, to remove occasions where they describe the gods as doing bad things. The idea being, if these are the stories you're telling your children, if you're telling the next generation, that's going to encourage them to do bad things, right? If they come to see the gods as opportunistic and self-interested, then they'll be opportunistic and self-interested, and that will destroy the city. Sorry about that. Close out that. Okay. So you don't need to read through every poem that he line edits. Maybe the general point that Plato thinks you achieve social control in part by controlling manifestations of culture in order to shape young minds. Maybe that's an important point. It's by now a very common point that no one really needs to be told, or rather that you get from a lot of directions. So like by the time you're a full-grown adult, you've probably absorbed the idea. It was, as far as we can tell, like groundbreaking in Plato's day. But as long as I just tell you he thought that, that's fine. I'm not going to share with you, I'm not going to make you read the sex lottery stuff or the eugenics stuff, in part because that's so bizarre. And really, the only point to draw from it is Plato is trying to find every way of maintaining a kind of social control that will keep the military in line. But since this city he's describing is so implausible anyway, the steps you would take to make it happen don't seem that important to learn. But what is the city? All right, so the city is going to be composed of three classes. There's going to be the craftsman and the auxiliaries and the guardians. Now, originally, Plato just breaks the beautiful city up into two classes, the craftsmen and the guardians. But over time, he introduces sort of a distinction within the guardians. The guardians are originally just the military class. But he slowly introduces a distinction in the kind of education certain members of the military class receive and in the functions they perform. And this is forced on him by his idea that everyone should only do the one job they're naturally suited for. Plato thinks people are born with certain natural skills and abilities, and in a well-functioning society, people will be directed into professions that match those natural skills and abilities so that they can be as productive as possible, so the society can be as efficient as possible. And fighting wars is different than ruling cities. And so the auxiliaries end up becoming the members of the military class who actually do the fighting, and the guardians are the members of the military class who guide the military. And because the whole problem that Plato's concerned with, once you move to the beautiful city, it was away from the healthy city, is controlling the people who do the fighting because they have the actual practical power. Almost the entire description of the beautiful city in the Republic is about how we're going to either train the guardians to be wise rulers or maintain the guardians' position in society. So the eugenics program is actually a combination of both. You're producing, Plato thinks, better people who will be better able to be wise, but you're also separating the guardians from everyone else. Like the more clear it is to everyone that the guardians are intellectually superior to everyone else, the more likely they are to obey. The the thing I told you about in the last video where I said that Plato effectively comes up with a racist storyline. He says that what should happen in his city is everyone should be told a story that human beings naturally have either bronze, silver, or gold in their blood, and gold people are better than silver people, and silver people are better than bronze people. But that at some point in the past, bronze, silver, and gold people mixed with each other in a way that leads to people who have mixed blood. And mixed blood people, if they combine in the right combinations, you could have two people who are mostly bronze blood, but their child is gold blooded. Right? So he wants to tell this story that there's differences in people, fundamental biological differences between people. And these fundamental biological differences will lead to differences in ability. And so differences in which class you end up in. So the craftsmen are supposed to be bronze-blooded people, the auxiliaries are silver-blooded people, and the guardians are gold-blooded people. That whole story is just there to get the craftsmen and the auxiliaries to obey the guardians. Because Plato thinks they will lack the wisdom to obey the guardians for the real reason, which is that the guardians are philosophers. Or eventually they're philosophers. Plato thinks you need to do like 20 to 30 years of study in music, mathematics, and things like that before you get to philosophy. But that once you do, philosophy is necessary for the most important kinds of wisdom. And so you have the guardians who are philosopher kings. Right? You might have heard this phrase before. The guardians, once they've gone through their full education, become philosopher kings. Okay. And there will be a crucial point of the Republic where Plato talks about the motivations of the philosopher kings that will potentially upend everything else in the book, but we'll get to that. So the story that Socrates tells about the Callipolis is all about how do we maintain a system where the auxiliaries will obey the guardians. There's no real mystery as to why the craftsmen will obey the auxiliaries. The auxiliaries have the weapons. Right? But why will the auxiliaries obey the guardians? All of that is interesting. Some of it is creepy. Right. So, for example, the guardians aren't allowed to have families because if they had families, their first loyalty would be to their family members and not to the state. So guardians don't get to know who their parents are or who their siblings are, which creates a problem because guardians are only supposed to have children with other guardians. But if they don't know who their family members are, how do you avoid incest? That's where the rigged sex lottery comes in. So all sorts of weirdness there. But the key thing is that just as the city is broken up into three classes, the soul is broken up into three parts. And those three parts are appetite, reason, and something we don't have a word for in English, so I'm going to use the Greek word. Now, the translation I'm using translates thumos as spirited. This has always struck me as just a terrible translation, not in that there's a better word to translate it, but this is just one of those places where we should admit there's no word in English that matches this Greek word. Spirited does not get sort of anywhere close to the combination of things that are contained within the part of the soul that Plato calls thumos. I'll describe each of the parts of the soul in a minute, but before I do, I want to describe what he means by parts of the soul. Plato thinks that there are three separate sources of motivation within you. There's appetite, thumos, and reason. They can each, on their own, motivate you to behave in certain ways. So each of these parts of the soul have their own associated desires or motivations. Right? They all also have their own goals. Right? I mean, you kind of have to have goals if you have desires and motivations. The reason I stress this is that this idea especially the idea that reason, the part of your soul or your mind that's rational, has its own distinctive motivations, runs counter to a very common way of thinking about rationality and reason that we have today. So I'm going to put this in green because it's the way of thinking about motivation that's most common in economics and really in a lot of the social sciences. Right? So there is this idea that a lot of people have. It was made popular really in the 1700s by a philosopher named David Hume, who was best friends with the economist slash philosopher Adam Smith. And this is part of why this view dominates economics. But there's an idea that there's a difference between desire and reason. Right? And the thought that a lot of people have is desire is what motivates you. All reason does is tells you what the world's like. Right? So your desire inclines you to prefer certain things to others. Right? So if you wanted to, if you asked, what explains or what part of the mind explains why I like pasta but don't like green beans? Well, that's the desiring part, or the faculty of desire, is the way Hume and Adam Smith would have put it. And that reason has nothing to do with it. Right? The only role that reason plays in action, according to this contemporary view, is reason tells you how to most effectively get what you desire. Now, why is it important to appreciate the difference between Plato's view and the sort of modern social scientific view, or view that's common in the modern social sciences? Well, on this view, and I'm just going to call it Humean, because he's the one who came up with it, the Humean view. On Hume's view, there's no such thing as an irrational desire. There's also no such thing as a rational desire. Desires don't have anything to do with reason. The only role that reason plays in desire is telling you how to most effectively achieve your desires. But no desire is in and of itself rational or irrational, and you can't convince people to not have certain desires. Right? You can't, through rational means, change what people want. And this is probably encapsulated most in the phrase, the heart wants what it wants. Right? The idea is, look, you desire what you desire, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't think your way out of it. And this goes along very naturally, not necessarily, but very naturally, with the idea that what you desire is not morally evaluable. Like, we can't say some desires are good and some desires are bad. We can say behavior is good or bad, but we can't say desires are good or bad, because you're just sort of stuck with them. Right? Now, there's a lot of assumptions involved in saying something like that, right? For example, there's an assumption that you can't just be stuck with something that makes you a bad person. So the idea that a lot of people have is, if, as lots of modern social scientists, and in fact a lot of psychologists think something like this, and it all goes back to the rise of social sciences in the late 1700s. We're all living with the results of dead philosophers and things they've said. If it's the case that you're just stuck with your desires and you can't apply reason to them to change them, you can't even make them stronger or weaker, right? It's not what the Humean view says is, if you have just a really, really, really strong desire to watch animals die horribly, right? If you have a desire to watch cats burn to death, you can't do anything about that desire. You can't think it through and come to have that desire go away. You can't even make the desire weaker. You're stuck with it. And so if you take that view, along with the idea that it's unfair to hold anyone responsible for things about themselves that they can't control or can't change, then it becomes pretty straightforward to say that we can't hold people responsible for what they desire, that what they desire can't be good or bad, right? That it's not wrong to want something, even if that thing is, something you would have to do bad things to get. The point is, Plato rejects this entirely. Plato thinks there are rational desires and irrational desires. Your appetite is full of irrational desires. Now, they're not all irrational, but many of them are. Right? Thumos can be a source of rational or irrational desires. Reason is the source of rational desires. And to the extent that you are dominated by one or other of these parts of yourself is just the extent to which you're a good person. Plato's way of thinking about the mind and the role that reason plays makes it possible to rationally evaluate the desires you have. Makes it possible to say that some desires are just irrational. Or another way of putting that is some goals, some things you want, you just shouldn't want because a rational person wouldn't want them. This is a very, very, very different way of viewing the human mind, of morality, that is very common today. The Humean view is so common that most people don't even realize it's a view that you have to defend. Lots of people who consider themselves very deep thinkers will just default to something like this without ever feeling like they need to explain what the view is or defend it. They just think it's obvious. But if you go back 500 years, everyone would have thought it was crazy, not obvious. Sometimes philosophers can have a huge impact on what everybody thinks, and in this case, David Hume did. Before David Hume, there was Plato. And Plato's idea was that the soul had three parts. Now, you might, if you have some familiarity with psychology, be aware that Sigmund Freud would later go on to say the mind had three parts: the id, ego, and superego. It's pretty clear Sigmund Freud was heavily influenced by Plato, but he added in the thing about people wanting to have sex with their parents and everything being about penises. Sigmund Freud is one of the more overrated thinkers in the history of thought. But he was influenced by Plato, especially in this division of the mind or the soul into three parts. Okay, so that's something about the significance of this view, but what does the view actually say? All right, so it says that you have different parts of your soul that each provide characteristic motivations. Appetite really has two kinds of motivations. Right? One kind of motivation is for bodily needs, the things you actually need to do, the sort of natural motivations, the desire to eat, the desire to drink, the desire to sleep, the desire to be warm when it's cold outside, right? The desire to cool off when it's hot outside, the desire for sex, right? The desire for all the natural things that human beings do, especially all the things that we need to live. Your appetite is the source of those motivations. And those, Plato thinks, those are good. Right? So actually, I'm going to change this from bodily needs to natural needs. But your appetite is also the source of lots of unnatural desires. Right? So if you've ever felt the desire to get drunk, right? Not to drink nice clean water, not to drink, some nice cold milk, but if you've ever just felt that desire to just like rip it up, right? Get yourself some liquor and drink till you're drunk. If you can't tell it, I've never, been much of an alcohol drinker myself through the way I'm talking. Well, I've just told you I've never been much of an alcohol drinker myself. It's the source of excessive versions of natural needs. So like the desire to get drunk is not a natural need at all. But there are some natural needs that you can sort of take too far. So the desire to gorge yourself on sweet or salty or fatty foods, the desire to have sex beyond the needs of sort of your society to procreate and things like that. But also just like weird things too. Plato gives an example of somebody being really into looking at dead bodies as coming from the appetitive parts of your soul. The sort of guiding principle of the appetite, whether it's the natural needs or the unnatural needs, is pleasure. The appetite is geared toward pleasure. We're built so that fulfilling our natural bodily needs gives us pleasure, right? So when you're hungry and you eat, it's pleasant. When you're thirsty and you drink, it's pleasant. When you're tired and you sleep, it feels nice, right? Sex feels nice. But we're also prone to desiring things that can give us pleasure without doing any good for us, like alcohol. Right? So the appetite has different kinds of, and I shouldn't say unnatural needs, but unnatural desires. It has natural motivations and unnatural motivations, but in the end, they're all directed towards pleasure. Reason is directed towards the good. Whereas the appetite seeks pleasure, the rational part of your soul seeks what's good. So the appetitive part of you just thinks what will get us the most pleasure, and the rational part of you will think what will get us what is genuinely good on its own. Now, I'm not going to put the good and bad versions of rational desires because Plato doesn't seem to think there are bad rational desires or bad motivations coming from reason. That's going to be part of the reason why he believes that reason ought to rule your soul, and that's what it is to be a virtuous person. Thumos, on the other hand, seeks honor. Right? So these are the three fundamental goals of human beings: pleasure, honor, and the good. And just like appetite, though, thumos can have good and bad versions, right? There's the good version and there's the bad version. The good version, let's actually start with the bad version of thumos. Thumos is a part of the soul that Plato associates with feelings of anger, shame, pride, dignity, self-respect. These are all tied in fairly obvious ways to the idea of honor, right? Deserving honor, getting honor. The good aspect of thumos, or thumos when it's operating correctly or appropriately, will lead a person to feel that doing good things is honorable. Whereas the bad version will focus not so much on deserving honor, but being honored by other people, right? So the perverted or corrupted version of thumos is one that will lead you to feel not shame at doing evil things, but shame at doing unpopular things. So instead of seeking to deserve honor, you just seek to get other people's approbation. And so there's a good and bad version. So the good is seeking honor or seeking to do what is honorable, and the bad is seeking to do what's actually, gets you approval, and not just from other people, but also from yourself. You can sort of internalize the general social attitude towards things, right? So there would have been a time in Western society, Western civilization, where someone who publicly expressed an interest in having their life's work be to accumulate money from commercial activities would have been a deeply shameful and embarrassing thing. For a long time in Europe, if you were engaged in commercial activity, you couldn't be a member of the nobility. You couldn't take part in all sorts of public activities. You were shamed and treated as sort of a degraded human being. Whereas now, right, who do we celebrate? We celebrate billionaires, right? We celebrate people who make it onto the Forbes 100 or 500 list. I don't know. Forbes puts together a list of rich people. Being a successful business person is a great thing in the minds of a lot of people. So cultural attitudes change, and they'll determine what people in general will give you approbation for or what they'll condemn you for. So Jeff Bezos in the Middle Ages, someone who lived as he lives, would have been, he still would have been rich and still would have in some sense been powerful and influential, but he would have been looked down upon. He would have been looked at as someone who was in some sense unclean. But now he is, for many people, like just, a great example of what you can do if you have good business sense and you're hardworking and things like that. Also, people like to make memes about how much he could help people on, post those memes on Facebook and Twitter. But thumos is associated with a set of emotions which are all themselves associated with the goal of honor. Right? So you have the goal of pleasure, the goal of honor, and the goal of living a good life. Right? And what Plato is going to say is that a virtuous person is someone who has the right relationship between the different parts of their soul. Effectively, the virtuous person will have a soul ruled by reason. Reason will inform and, in some sense, control thumos, that sense of, or that part of your soul that seeks honor and has a sense of pride and disdain and shame and anger and things like that, because only with the aid of thumos, or the spirited part of your soul, can your appetites be controlled. The idea is this. If it's just reason versus appetite, right? Let's say you get into some weird and freaky stuff and you develop appetites for that stuff. You develop strong desires for the pleasure associated with those things, but your reason tells you, actually, those things aren't very good. Those things aren't good for you, right? Just your reason telling you those aren't good is, for most people, not going to be enough to stop you from doing it. You've probably all had this experience of sort of internal psychic conflict. You want something, but you don't think it's good for you, right? And it's very common, I think, for most of us to have that desire, that powerful desire, overwhelm the thought that the thing is bad for you. You go do the thing anyway. This, by the way, is going to be how Plato explains how akrasia is possible. So remember, akrasia, or weakness of the will, or what also gets called incontinence, the inability to control oneself. This is something that Plato had Socrates deny happens in the Protagoras. But in the Republic, it's a big part of the view that weakness of the will is possible. Because what's weakness of the will? Weakness of the will is when you follow your appetite and not your reason. Your reason allows you to appreciate that something is wrong or bad, but the desires from your appetite overwhelm your reason. Now, when does that happen? Well, it happens when thumos is listening to appetite rather than reason. It's only with the help of thumos, the spirited part of you, the part that feels disdain or shame at doing bad things when it's been trained properly. It's only when thumos helps reason that reason can govern appetites. So a virtuous person is going to be one who has a well-developed sense of reason. Right? They have the ability to determine accurately what is good. Their reason hasn't been corrupted or perverted. And that's going to also control their thumos, their spirited sense, which will allow them to restrain their appetites. And what Plato's going to say is that these correspond to different virtues, right? So reason, a rational part of the soul that is operating properly, will be associated with wisdom, right? A sense of, an appropriate sense of honor, someone who takes honor or feels that the right things are honorable, will be a person who is courageous. A well-developed, unperverted, uncorrupted thumos will lead to being a courageous person. What makes thumos uncorrupted or unperverted? Well, just when it does what a wise, rational part of your soul tells it to do. Appetites have no particular virtue associated with them, according to Plato. But when appetite is controlled by reason and thumos, it's going to lead to a person being temperate. because you're not going to overindulge. You're not going to get drunk all the time. You're not going to have sex with every person who you think looks attractive. So then the question is just going to be, well, where does justice fit in all this? And what Plato says is justice is what happens when your soul is arranged this way. Justice is when everything is working together correctly. And so, just as with the Protagoras, you're going to get the view that justice, wisdom, courage, and temperance all go together. The unity of the virtues. The analysis here, though, unlike in the Protagoras, where Plato had Socrates say that the virtues are all just ways of knowing how to get what will give you pleasure. Now, what Plato says is, no, to be a virtuous person is to have your soul in the right kind of internal harmony, where reason guides the soul. It guides the soul through the alliance of reason and thumos, which restrains appetite. And this is going to lead to you being a just, wise, courageous, and temperate individual. And this is also going to be the key to the answer to the original question. The original question being, why should we be good? What makes being good good for us? Or being just good for us? And that's going to be something